So if there's one key ingredient to the rapid rise of Albanian organised crime, then it's cocaine. In the previous episode we discussed how Albanian criminals have cornered the market in Europe's most used drug, which is marijuana, but they can really attribute their status as dominant players in European organised crime to the most profitable drug in Europe, which is cocaine. So in these next two episodes, we'll cover how Albanian criminals work their way up the criminal ladder and eventually becoming high-level players, and along the way transforming the supply of cocaine to Europe, becoming one of the first groups to control the entire cocaine supply chain from source through to retail. So we'll start with their origins in the trade and their presence in Latin America. So as we've covered in previous episodes, many Albanian criminals got their start in organised crime by working closely with the Italian Mafia, particularly the 'Ndrangheta, which is in Calabria, just over the Ionian Sea from Albania. Now, Albanian groups quickly established a reputation for reliability, particularly in logistics. They delivered shipments on time, they delivered them uncut at a time when other groups were diluting the quality of the shipments and potentially skimming off the top to keep cocaine for themselves. Now, at this time, as we've mentioned, they were working closely with the 'Ndrangheta, who themselves had used the cocaine supply chain to transform themselves from the poor relations of the Italian underworld to becoming one of the Italian Mafia's richest groups. And this is down to the way in which they secured supply from Latin America and dominated the European cocaine trade. So the 'Ndrangheta brokered direct relationships with Latin American cartels and paramilitary groups. And until the disbanding of the United Self-Defense Forces of Colombia, or the AUC, in 2006, the 'Ndrangheta reportedly controlled up to 80% of the entire European cocaine trade. Now, as we mentioned in our previous episodes, Albanian criminals began to travel to Latin America to act as emissaries on the 'Ndrangheta's behalf, as well as on behalf of groups such as Galician criminals who had close relationships with Colombian cartels as well. So the disbanding of the AUC led to a splintering of the control of the Colombian cocaine trade, which meant that there were now more suppliers and more opportunities for European groups to forge contacts and secure suppliers for trafficking directly to Europe. And from the late 2000s and early 2010s, Albanian criminals began to settle in Latin America, not just acting as emissaries on behalf of other groups, but forging their own contacts and dealing with Latin American suppliers directly. In the present day, Albanian-speaking criminals have a presence in Peru, Brazil, Colombia, and transit countries such as Panama, and especially in Ecuador. Many of these traffickers are criminals with a past in Europe who are potentially looking to escape from law enforcement or avoid arrest and restarting their criminal careers in a different continent. So from the early 2010s onwards, Albanian criminals are setting up a presence in Latin America, and this is an opportune time for them to be doing this. So between 2012 and 2016, negotiations began to take place between the Colombian government and the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, or the FARC, who controlled significant areas of coca production in the country. And this saw an increase in production of coca from 2012 onwards. So after the FARC disbanded in 2016, a whole host of other criminal actors looked to fill the space that they'd left behind in the market. And this has led to a massive increase in the production of Colombian cocaine. So according to US figures, the cultivation of coca in Colombia has risen from 78,000 hectares in 2012 to 245,000 hectares in 2020. So for groups such as the 'Ndrangheta, which still controlled a significant amount of the cocaine trade in Europe and the supply to Europe, this meant that there's now almost too much cocaine for them to handle. So this means that other groups, such as Albanian-speaking groups, can develop a greater share of the market without coming into conflict with other groups. Now, at the same time that this is going on, the demand for cocaine in Europe is also rising exponentially.
The actual production of the coca leaves, there's not much. That's not where the money is being made. The real money doesn't come from the production itself either, because that's usually small groups that produce the cocaine as well. But the trafficking from the production area to the port. That is a big markup, and then the biggest markup comes from the shipment from the port to anywhere else in the world.
So, having spent years establishing contacts in South America and developing a reputation for reliability with both buyers and sellers, gaining experience and expertise at working with and creating their own established trafficking routes, and with existing partners in Europe, especially close ties with Albanian-speaking groups across the continent, Albanian criminals were now perfectly positioned to exploit this opportunity. So how did they capitalize on this? Well, rather than just settling into a niche as brokers, some Albanian groups did something far more ambitious. So for years, international distributors of cocaine to Europe worked separately from the wholesale buyers who would then sell the drug across the continent. So wholesalers would be involved in the acquisition and in the storage and distribution of cocaine from its source onto regional and local markets. Sometimes this would involve dedicated brokers who would facilitate the contact between the two groups, so the buyers and the suppliers. Local networks in Europe would then take charge of the mid-level distribution and retail selling. Some Albanian-speaking networks, however, successfully created end-to-end business models. They provided their own financing, they secured their own supply, and they arranged their own shipments. They then organised distribution across European countries on arrival, and then within those countries they controlled retail as well, selling directly to the consumer. Albanian organisations also dramatically increased the size of individual shipments, so seizures of over a ton are now routinely reported across Europe and within the ports of Latin America as well. This has had massive implications for the European cocaine trade. So wholesalers in Europe, for example in the Netherlands, had established a price of around about 30,000 euros per kilo for cocaine. By securing supply directly in Latin America, Albanian groups were able to obtain cocaine for as little as 3,500 euros per kilo. Now, rather than attempting to make as much money as quickly as possible, some Albanian groups recognized that profit margins within cocaine were so high that they were happy to drastically reduce the price and therefore undercutting the competition. So wholesale prices in countries such as the Netherlands and the UK, and to a lesser extent Italy, have reduced year on year from 2013 to 2019. Not only are they reducing the price, they're also increasing the purity of cocaine as well. So by providing higher quality cocaine at a much lower wholesale price, in addition to their existing reputation for reliability and an established reputation for violence if necessary, Albanian groups quickly became one of the dominant suppliers on the continent by establishing a almost unbeatable business model.
Get in-depth insight on the activities of Albanian organised crime. Transnational organised crime is one of the biggest threats to security in Europe today, and the Albanian Mafia is one of the most significant organised crime groups on the continent. Using open source reporting and data from the Intelligence Fusion Threat Intelligence platform, we'll be releasing a comprehensive report on the state of Albanian organised crime groups and their impact on global security. Sign up now to receive the report as soon as it's released. Click the link in the description below.
So what we've seen here is using business acumen. They've reduced prices, they've increased purity, they're offering a better product at a lower price, and rather than using violence to force out the competition, they're instead offering a very good product that rival groups are happy to purchase from them instead. So who are these contacts that the Albanian Mafia has established in Latin America? Well, let's start with Colombia.
Cocaine production in Latin America is concentrated in Colombia, Peru, and Bolivia, but most is produced in Colombia. That's the epicenter of cocaine production. There's hundreds of different actors involved in this, but to generalize, in Colombia there's three main actors. The first is the FARC, so the former guerrillas, the former communist guerrillas, who actually signed a peace agreement with the Colombian government in 2016. But the FARC who didn't sign the peace agreement or have since then taken up arms again, they are now divided into multiple different factions across Colombia, but they still still focus on cocaine production and trafficking. The second is a similar one, also a guerrilla group, but a still active one, the ELN. They're currently in negotiations with the government, peace talks, about a potential agreement like the FARC had, but still they conduct attacks regularly in Colombia. So similar to the FARC, they are also divided into multiple different factions. But these are the two main guerrilla groups. Well, one guerrilla group and one ex-guerrilla group still operating in Colombia. So the third actor is Clan del Golfo. They call themselves the Urabeños. They originated from a paramilitary movement who was initially created to fight the guerrillas in the 1980s. But right now they're just sort of... it's not really a drug cartel in the sense that most people think of a drug cartel. So back in the day you had, for example, Pablo Escobar, and Pablo Escobar was in the center, and then around him were his, key allies or like right-hand men, and they would organize the whole organization. Clan del Golfo have a kind of a different structure, so not a central figure, but different cells operating together. You could see it as like a franchise, where Clan del Golfo is the franchise, and then independent traffickers operate within their domain. So they have a certain territory which they control, and certain routes and certain services, but they cater to independent drug traffickers, and those independent drug traffickers pay a fee to Clan del Golfo to produce cocaine and to organize the production of coca before you produce cocaine, to traffic it to another city or a port. So they're more like facilitators in a way.
So according to open source reporting, Albanian criminal groups have been linked with the Urabeños or the Clan del Golfo. They've been linked with FARC dissidents such as the Segunda Marquetalia, as well as smaller groups such as the Border Commandos, which is made up of a group called La Constru, who formed an alliance with the 48th Front of the FARC. In Ecuador, open source reporting has linked them with a prison gang known as R7, but also reportedly they are working with pretty much every criminal group in the country. Now, local gangs within Ecuador are warring amongst themselves to control as much of the cocaine supply as they possibly can, and to attain favourable relationships with other groups, including Europeans such as Albanians. Now, the Ndrangheta, who, as we've mentioned, work closely with Albanian gangs, have a good relationship with the First Capital Command in Brazil, also known as the PCC. Now, they reportedly have significant control of the port of Santos, which exports more cocaine to Europe than any other port in Latin America. And then again, in other transit countries, such as Costa Rica, a police operation in 2020 arrested a member of the Ndrangheta in the port of Limon, as well as 2 Albanians who were operating in Europe as part of the same operation. So in 2020, a police operation called Los Blancos exposed the reality of how complex these Albanian trafficking network groups had become. The Compagnia Bello was perhaps the most sophisticated and complex cocaine trafficking network run by Albanians. Now, the Compagnia Bello was led by a man called Dritan Recepi from a prison cell in Ecuador, or at least at the time. Now, he is a career criminal who was arrested on drug trafficking charges in Ecuador in 2014, but also had an arrest warrant out for a double homicide in Albania in the late 90s, and was also wanted by authorities in Belgium and Italy, and also featured on Britain's most wanted list in 2013. So Compagnia Bello was a network of between 10 and 15 different Albanian-speaking organizations operating in different parts of the world along different parts of the supply chain. So in South America, they negotiated directly with cartels and secured the supply of cocaine. They then arranged huge shipments to Europe, particularly the ports of Antwerp and Rotterdam. As part of their network, they then had members who removed the cocaine from the ports and then arranged the transportation of cocaine across the rest of the continent. So with accomplices based in Italy, in the Netherlands and Albania, the group was able to distribute cocaine to consumers across Europe. Now, over the course of a 5-year-long operation starting in 2015, members were arrested in Italy, the Netherlands, Germany, Greece, Romania, Hungary, Spain, Switzerland, the UK, Albania, Ecuador, and Dubai. Now, Dubai is where the apparently second in command, a man by the name of Denis Matoshi, was living. Now, Matoshi, who was also known as Eldi Dizdari, is reportedly a close cousin of a man by the name of Arba Cekai, who facilitated the shipping of cocaine from Ecuador into Albania from around about 2009 until his arrest in 2018, and was one of the first Albanian criminals to start a direct supply from Latin America to Albania. So this operation, Los Blancos, was the largest ever of its kind against Albanian-speaking organised crime. So we mentioned that members of the Company Bello, as well as many other Albanian criminals, are based in Ecuador. So Ecuador reported the third most seizures of cocaine in 2021. So in the first 4 months of 2022, just in the port city of Guayaquil, police seized more than 31 tons of cocaine. This is compared to 12 tons of cocaine that was seized over that same time period in 2021, which suggests that the supply of cocaine is getting even larger in Ecuador. So the increased demand in Europe and the consequently incredibly lucrative cocaine trade in the country has led to significant violence in recent years as gangs fight to control supply, control trafficking networks and trafficking routes, specific ports, and secure partnerships with other groups, including the Albanians. But it's not just European criminals who are based in Ecuador. There's also a significant presence of Mexican cartels in the country. So the Sinaloa and the Jalisco New Generation cartel are both said to have established close partnerships with Ecuadorian gangs.
Last year, the homicide rate doubled, and this year it's set to double again, at least, from what I can tell. So the violence is escalating really quickly now, and that is because several gangs in Ecuador, I think that there's like 27, but the bigger ones, they're aligned with Mexican cartels. So they're supplying Mexican cartels essentially with Colombian cocaine. But now that there's, in Mexico, there's sort of a contest between the Sinaloa cartel and the Jalisco New Generation cartel, who are both allied with different Ecuadorian gangs in the port or in Guayaquil. These Ecuadorian gangs have gone at each other. Most of these homicides are actually in prisons because the gangs operate from prisons usually. So I think last year there was a prison riot with 120 deaths in one prison in one day. So if you think of prison riots, you probably think about shaves and makeshift knives and burning mattresses. But in Ecuador, they have fully automatic weapons and explosives inside the prisons, which is causing it to be so violent. It's only possible if the prison system is deeply corrupt and the police or the prison guards are involved in some way. And all of this violence is basically a proxy war of the Mexican cartels, if you say it in simple terms. So one side is supported by one Mexican cartel, the other side by another. And they supply these groups with weapons. And in Guayaquil, for example, these Ecuadorian gangs are murdering each other. And the scenes that we now get from Ecuador, where bodies hang from lampposts and bridges, that reminds me of Mexican scenes where now it's kind of spreading into Ecuador, this type of like extreme violence. That's new.
And we now see what you might term Mexican-style violence in the country. So bodies hanging from bridges, political assassinations and assassinations of the police, as well as gruesome executions of rival gang members. But several Albanians have also been killed in Ecuador in recent years too. So in early 2022, a man by the name of Ergistashi was shot dead in a restaurant in Guayaquil. Now, Ergistashi had reportedly become an important broker in the cocaine trade in the country, forming a liaison between South American cartels and Balkan criminals. He'd previously operated in Italy, where he'd been arrested on drug trafficking charges in 2014. Now, Ergistashi was reportedly operating as an independent broker rather than part of an established criminal network. And his killing followed the assassination of a number of other Albanians in the country too. So in November 2020, a man by the name of Adriatic Tresar was murdered inside his luxury property in Dol, just outside of Guayaquil. Now, reportedly, this involved his assassins dressing as police in order to gain access to his property and then killing him once they gained access. So Adriatic Tresar had arrived in Ecuador in 2011, so around about the same time that many other Albanian criminals were establishing themselves on the continent. Now, he had allegedly been linked to a number of contract killings and attempted murders in the country and was under investigation for drug trafficking at the time of his killing. Now, one of these may have been the death of a man called Ilir Hedri, who was arrested at the same time as Dritan Recepi and was shot dead in May 2017. Now, this violence is likely being carried out between Albanian groups themselves, and the recent uptick in violence could potentially be linked to the Compagnia Bello looking to reassert their position after taking a significant hit following the police operation in 2020. So what's significant about Ecuador, as well as its location between Colombia and Peru, which are the world's largest producers of cocaine, is that Ecuador is also the world's largest exporter of bananas, especially to Europe. Now, this means that there's already an established and significant maritime trade between Ecuador and the European continent, and it's a particular good which is especially useful for cocaine traffickers in that it's perishable and therefore has to be expedited through customs as quickly as possible. Now, most of the cocaine seized in the European Union and the wider European continent is transported by sea, in shipping containers specifically. This means that traffickers maintain a presence near ports at both ends of the shipment, as well as maintaining alliances with groups that control these ports.
So some of these ports are like firmly in control of a singular group, but it doesn't happen that often. A lot of the times, drug traffickers, for example, Colombians, will make use of local gangs to get into the ports, and these local gangs will often fight with each other. So this is now going on in Guayaquil in Ecuador, for example. And that is because this port is being contested. But there are also other ports where larger drug seizures are being made, but they are quite safe, relatively. So they're probably in control of a singular group, where in Ecuador you see the turf war playing out.
Now, the vast majority of cocaine seized in Europe has come from Brazil, Ecuador, or Colombia. However, criminals are increasingly diversifying where they are shipping cocaine from. Now, which specific ports have reported links with Albanian-speaking groups? So this also includes groups that have close ties to the Albanian Mafia, such as the 'Ndrangheta, or local criminal actors that have close ties with either of these European groups. So we've mentioned the port of Guayaquil in Ecuador, and this is believed to be the main enclave of Albanian-speaking organised crime. And there are reports that Albanian traffickers are increasingly basing themselves in Peru, potentially to avoid the high-profile violence that's currently taking place in Ecuador. Now, the port in Peru that has significant links to cocaine trafficking to Europe is the port of Callao. There are also multiple ports in Colombia that are used by local groups to traffic cocaine to Europe and the wider world. These include the port of Cartagena, the port of Buenaventura, and the port of Santa Maria, as well as several others. Now, these groups have direct ties with the Albanian Mafia, as well as a number of other European criminal groups. Now, the port of Santos in Brazil reports more seizures of cocaine destined for Europe than any other port in Latin America. Now, this is reportedly controlled by the PCC, or the First Capital Command in Brazil, which has close ties to the 'Ndrangheta, which, as we've mentioned, also works closely with the Albanian Mafia. And in 2021, for instance, an Albanian businessman was shot dead in Sao Paulo, which is where the port of Santos is based. Now, the PCC also has a significant presence in the port of Villeta in Paraguay, while record seizures of cocaine were reported in Panama first in 2019 and then again in 2021. So as coca production has boomed in Latin America, Albanian syndicates have been able to take advantage of their presence on the continent, their existing reputation for reliability, and their existing contacts, as well as their knowledge of local markets and trafficking routes to secure supply on the continent. But that's just part of the story. It's their access to the lucrative European market that has allowed them to transform themselves and become one of the world's largest organised crime groups. So in the next episode, we'll take a look at how Albanian organised crime groups smuggle major quantities of cocaine into Europe and how they've come to dominate the market on the continent.